There's a pattern in history that no one wants to believe, because to believe, it means accepting that even the greatest powers eventually fall. Every generation thinks they're different, smarter, more advanced, too modern to make the same mistakes as those before. But if you look closely, behind the wars, the flags, and the speeches, you start to see something unsettling. A hidden cycle that destroys every empire that forgets where its strength came from. It doesn't begin with defeat. It begins with success. Every empire starts with the same spark, ambition, courage, a hunger to build something greater than itself. At first, the rise feels unstoppable. The economy grows, the military expands. The people believe their nation has found the secret to lasting power. But buried inside that success is the seed of collapse. Because once a nation becomes rich, it forgets what made it strong. It starts spending instead of producing, consuming instead of creating, believing its wealth will never run out. It's easy to see the pattern when you look back. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union all thought they were invincible. Spain had the gold of the New World, Britain had an empire upon which the sun never set, and the Soviet Union was a military superpower. Each one believed their system was unshakable. Each one thought collapse could only happen to others. But the same steps that built their greatness also destroyed them. Overextension, debt, decay, denial, and now, in our time, we are following the same path. The same blind confidence, the same illusions, the same slow erosion beneath the surface that no one wants to admit is happening. The headlines talk about innovation, progress, and global influence, but history doesn't measure power by headlines. It measures it by stability, by balance, by how long a system can sustain itself before it cracks. And every empire, without fail, eventually crosses the invisible line between expansion and exhaustion. You can almost think of it like a 7-step equation, a law of civilization that repeats itself across centuries. First comes expansion, then overreach. Then the currency weakens, the debt piles up, and the people start losing faith in the system they once trusted. Production slows, division grows, and finally, everything that once looked permanent begins to unravel fast. The only variable that changes is how long it takes. The strange thing is, the warnings are always clear. Economists see the numbers, historians see the parallels. Citizens feel the pressure in their daily lives. Yet almost no one believes the collapse will happen in their own lifetime. There's always an excuse. It's different now. Technology will save us. We've learned from the past. But history is patient. It doesn't need to convince you. It just waits for the math to play out. If you want to understand where we're heading, you have to stop listening to promises and start watching patterns. Because the story of every empire, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, and now the United States, isn't about war or politics. It's about human nature. We rise, we prosper, we forget, and then inevitably we fall. Spain was once the richest empire on earth. In the 1500s, it ruled half the known world. Gold and silver flowed in from the Americas like rivers of light. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic came back heavy, with treasure, silver from Mexico, gold from Peru, jewels from lands newly conquered. To most of Europe, Spain looked unstoppable. Its armies dominated, its navy ruled the seas, and its king believed he had been chosen by God to command an empire that would last forever. But buried beneath all that glittering wealth was the beginning of a slow, invisible collapse. It started the same way it always does with overconfidence. King Philip II inherited an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on it. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as the guardian of a divine mission. So he did what every powerful leader does. When he believes his wealth is endless, he tried to control everything. Spain fought wars everywhere at once, against France, against the Ottoman Empire, against rebels in the Netherlands, against England, and across its colonies in the New World. By the late 1500s, half of Spain's money went straight to the military. But even half wasn't enough. When taxes couldn't keep up, the crown turned to an easier solution, money printing, 16th century style. Spanish coins were supposed to be pure silver, but soon they were mixed with cheaper metals like copper. The face value stayed the same, but the coins themselves were worth less and less. Inflation exploded. Prices doubled, then tripled. The currency that once symbolized power became a joke, and because the government couldn't stop spending, it kept borrowing. Spanish kings took loans from Italian bankers, German bankers, anyone who would lend them gold. When they couldn't pay it back, they simply declared bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years. Each time, they promised to fix the problem. Each time, they sank deeper into debt. The strangest part was that Spain had more money than anyone. But that was the problem. When gold and silver poured in from the New World, people stopped working. Why build ships when you can buy them? Why grow food when you can import it? The rich became obsessed with luxury. The poor survived on whatever was left. Manufacturing collapsed, farms went empty. The empire became addicted to buying instead of making. The same silver that made Spain powerful drained away to pay for foreign goods, French wine, Dutch tools, Italian silk. The treasure that made them rich made everyone else richer instead. By the early 1600s, the illusion shattered. The mines slowed, the silver shipments fell, and the economy crashed. Crime spread, hunger rose, and the best minds, the inventors, the traders, the thinkers left for other countries. Spain had been the center of the world. Now it was a shell of its former self, a kingdom drowning in its own gold. That's the curse of endless wealth. When you believe money itself makes you strong, you forget what real strength is, the ability to produce, to adapt, to create. Spain never learned that lesson. And because of that, it became the first great empire to collapse under the weight of its own success. By the dawn of the 1900s, Britain stood at the height of its power. It ruled over a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its people. Its navy was unmatched, its cities glittered with wealth, and its currency, the pound sterling, was trusted in every corner of the planet. The empire was so vast that people said the sun never set on British soil. But behind the glory, cracks had already begun to form. The same old pattern was repeating the one Spain had followed centuries earlier. Expansion had turned into overreach, and pride had turned into blindness. Britain's power came from trade, and trade was protected by force. The empire stretched across 6 continents, from India to Africa to the Caribbean. Every colony needed soldiers, ships, and administrators. Maintaining it all cost more than anyone wanted to admit. By 1914, Britain was already heavily in debt. And when war came to Europe, the empire faced a terrible choice: stay out and preserve its wealth, or fight and risk everything to prove its power. Britain chose war. World War I became the most expensive conflict the world had ever seen. Britain borrowed billions, mostly from the United States, to keep its armies supplied and its navy afloat. By the time the war ended in 1918, Britain had technically won, but victory came with a price. It had traded its financial independence for survival. The empire that had once been the world's creditor was now drowning in debt to its former colony across the Atlantic. Then came the next stage, the currency crisis. For centuries, the pound had been backed by gold. But after the war, Britain's gold reserves were nearly gone. Still, the government tried to restore confidence by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pretending the pound was as strong as it had been before the war. It wasn't. The pound was overvalued, exports collapsed, unemployment soared, and factories closed. The illusion of stability came at the cost of real economic pain. By 1931, Britain couldn't keep up the lie any longer. It abandoned the gold standard, and the pound's value plunged overnight. The symbol of global power had become just another piece of paper. Debt kept rising through the Great Depression and into World War II. Once again, Britain fought bravely, and once again, it borrowed beyond reason to do it. By the time the war ended in 1945, the empire was exhausted. India, the jewel of the crown, was gone by 1947. One by one, the colonies that had built Britain's wealth slipped away. The empire that once ruled the oceans was forced to sell off its possessions just to pay the bills. By the 1970 seconds, the British Empire existed only in history books. The pound had fallen, the factories were quiet, and London's global influence had faded. What remained was a proud nation still pretending it was powerful, a shadow of the empire it once was. Britain had conquered the world, but in the end, it couldn't conquer debt. The same force that built its empire ambition became the very thing that destroyed it. When the Soviet Union rose after World War II, it looked unstoppable. It had crushed Nazi Germany, stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, and built a military powerful enough to rival the United States. Its leaders promised a new kind of empire, not of kings or colonies, but of ideology. Factories, farms, and families were all bound to the same dream that communism would outlast capitalism. For a while, it seemed to work. The red flag flew over half the world, and the West feared its shadow. But beneath the parades, the missiles, and the slogans, something was quietly breaking. The Soviet system had built tanks instead of trust, control instead of creativity. Everything belonged to the state, and the state belonged to a small circle of men who demanded loyalty above truth. They measured success in numbers, how many tractors produced, how many tons of steel forged, how many enemies crushed. But the numbers were lies. Factories faked reports to please officials. Farms pretended to meet impossible quotas. Whole cities were built on paper. The result was an illusion of power, strong on the outside, hollow within. By the 1970 seconds, the cracks were visible. The economy had stopped growing. Supermarkets had empty shelves. People waited in long lines for bread, meat, even toilet paper. The country that sent the first man into space couldn't feed its own people. Oil and gas kept the system alive for a while, selling resources abroad for real money, but that only delayed the inevitable. When oil prices fell in the 1980 seconds, the Soviet Union's lifeline snapped. Still, the government refused to face the truth. Instead of fixing the economy, it doubled down on the military. Billions were spent building tanks, submarines, and nuclear weapons to compete with America. Soviet citizens were told they lived in a worker's paradise, but they could see the truth on Western TV, cars, food, freedom. The gap between propaganda and reality grew too wide to hide. The system was collapsing from inside, not from war, but from exhaustion. Then came the final unraveling. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. One by one, the nations of Eastern Europe broke free. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. The Soviet Union could have crushed them, but it couldn't afford to. It was broke, the ruble was worthless, and the military couldn't even pay its soldiers. In just 900 days, an empire that had lasted for nearly 70 years dissolved into dust. On the 26th of December 1991, the red flag over the Kremlin came down for the last time. There was no invasion, no grand battle, no hero to save it. The Soviet Union didn't die by force, it died because it couldn't sustain itself. That's the hidden truth of power. Empires rarely fall from enemies. They collapse from the weight of their own denial. When a nation believes it can control everything and listen to no one, it's already halfway to ruin. The Soviet Union didn't learn that lesson until it was too late. For a long time, America looked like it had broken the cycle. The land of endless opportunity, innovation, and freedom. The country that rebuilt the world after war, led in technology, and stood as a symbol of strength and stability. For decades, the dollar ruled global trade, the military kept peace, and the economy seemed unstoppable. People believed America was different, immune to the same fate that destroyed every empire before it. But the pattern hasn't disappeared, it's just wearing new clothes. The story that began with Spain's gold and Britain's empire is repeating itself, only this time, it's happening here. The United States has become the world's most powerful nation, with military bases in more than 80 countries, troops in over 150, and commitments that stretch across every ocean. Every empire before believed they could protect everything, everywhere. None of them could. America spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, yet still says it isn't enough. Tanks, carriers, aircraft, the same tools of dominance that once defined Spain, Britain, and the USSR are now our lifeblood. And, like them, we've reached the point where our power costs more than we can afford to maintain. To fund that power, we turn to something invisible: printed money. When the United States left the gold standard in 1971, the dollar became pure promise. Since then, we've printed trillions. Each new crisis, each new war, each new bailout, more dollars, less value. It's the modern version of Spain's copper coins or Britain's collapsing pound. The method has changed, but the math hasn't. Inflation eats away at savings, the middle class struggles to keep up, and the nation that once prided itself on discipline has learned to survive on debt. That debt is now larger than the entire economy. Interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion a year. We borrow to pay interest on the money we already borrowed, the same death spiral that destroyed every empire before us. The difference is, we call it normal. Meanwhile, America's factories are silent. The nation that once built everything now imports almost everything: electronics, steel, medicine, even basic necessities. We design in America, but we produce somewhere else. The wealth we create flows out just as quickly as it comes in, like Spain's silver centuries ago. We've traded production for consumption, independence for convenience. And beneath all of it, the foundation is cracking. Trust in government, in media, in institutions, gone. Cities crumble, families struggle, violence rises, and addiction quietly eats away at what's left. We call it progress, but deep down, everyone feels the same unease that something fundamental is slipping. The scariest part isn't that we're following the pattern, it's that we know we are and still refuse to stop. We tell ourselves technology will save us, that we're too advanced to collapse. But history doesn't care about optimism. It cares about math. Every empire thought it was different. Every empire was wrong. And now, the mirror is turned on us. Every empire has a moment when the world stops believing in its money. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, then all at once. For Spain, it was when merchants stopped accepting their silver coins at face value. For Britain, it was the day the pound could no longer hold its promise of gold. For America, that moment is beginning now, and almost no one wants to admit it. For nearly a century, the US dollar has been the foundation of global trade. Every barrel of oil, every shipment of goods, every international loan, all priced in dollars. It gave America a superpower few understood, the ability to print the world's money. Other nations had to earn dollars to buy what they needed. The United States could simply create them. It was the ultimate privilege and the ultimate temptation. But no currency stays trusted forever. Confidence is fragile. The more money you print, the more promises you make, the more the world starts to doubt. Over time, that doubt turns into action. Other countries begin to hedge, quietly moving away from the system they no longer trust. We're seeing it now, nations forming trade agreements in their own currencies, central banks buying record amounts of gold, and global powers like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia testing life beyond the dollar. It's not rebellion, it's preparation. For decades, the world held dollars because it believed they would always hold value. But after printing trillions in just a few years, that faith is fading. Inflation eats away at purchasing power, interest payments explode, and the world begins to ask the same question every empire dreads. What happens when the money stops working? When a reserve currency starts to fail, it's not just the money that collapses, it's the entire system built around it. America's global influence depends on everyone needing the dollar. If that demand disappears, all the dollars sitting in foreign reserves come flooding back home. Trillions of them. Prices soar, imports become unaffordable, and the illusion of endless wealth shatters. It's the same math that destroyed Spain's silver and Britain's pound. Too much debt, too little trust, too late to change. At first, it won't look like a collapse. It will look like headlines about de-dollarization or diversified reserves. But behind those polite words is panic, the slow loss of belief that the dollar will hold its value. And once faith breaks, it can't be rebuilt by speeches or printing presses. History's warning is simple. When the world stops believing in your currency, it stops believing in your power. Spain learned it when their silver turned worthless. Britain learned it when the pound became a shadow of its past. And America will learn it when the same system it built to rule the world begins to rule against it. The fall of a currency isn't just an economic event, it's an identity crisis. When the dollar fades, so does the illusion of control. That's when empires wake up and realize the unthinkable. Their wealth was never infinite, and their power was borrowed time. Collapse never looks like collapse at first. It begins with small cracks, a market dip here, a credit downgrade there, a promise that everything is under control. The television experts sound calm, the leaders look confident, and life seems normal. But beneath the surface, the chain reaction has already started. Debt, currency, and confidence, the three pillars that hold an empire upright, begin to crumble, one after another. And when they go fast. History shows how quickly strength can turn into shock. Spain's empire didn't fade over centuries, it unraveled in a few chaotic decades. Britain's dominance ended in a generation. The Soviet Union, with all its tanks and nukes, collapsed in just 900 days. That's how fast it happens when an empire loses faith in itself and when the world stops believing too. One moment, you're a superpower. The next, you're a memory. For the United States, that unraveling would begin with a financial tremor, a debt crisis, a currency shock, a moment when investors realized the math no longer works. The government would print more money to fix the problem, just like every empire before, but that would only make it worse. Inflation would rise, interest rates would spike, and the trust that keeps the system alive would start to vanish. Then comes the panic. The dollar, once the world's safe haven, begins to fall. Foreign nations rush to sell off their reserves before they lose more value. Trillions of dollars come pouring back home. Suddenly, everything becomes more expensive. Fuel, food, medicine. The shelves don't empty all at once, but they start to thin. And when people finally see that the money in their hands doesn't stretch like it used to, fear replaces faith. In the halls of power, the same denial that destroyed past empires would repeat. Politicians would promise recovery, central banks would issue reassurances, and experts would insist the system is strong. But no speech can stop an avalanche once it starts. The markets would collapse faster than they could be saved. The debts would become impossible to pay. The world that once depended on America would begin to move on without it. The military, stretched thin and underfunded, would struggle to maintain its reach. Bases would close. Allies would drift away. At home, divisions would deepen as people look for someone to blame: the government, the rich, the poor, the other side. But none of them would see the real enemy, the pattern itself. The same one that Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union ignored until it was too late. And then, one morning, without a war, without a warning, the empire that once commanded the world would wake up to find the power gone, not taken, lost. The currency weakened, the debt unpayable, the illusion shattered. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, then all at once. And when it does, it doesn't just end an empire. It ends an era, the moment when the story we told ourselves about being different finally runs out of time. Every empire tells the same story. It rises from struggle, learns to build, learns to lead, and then forgets everything that made it strong. Wealth becomes comfort. Power becomes pride. Pride becomes blindness. And when the fall comes, it always feels sudden, even though the warning signs were there all along. The greatest illusion of all isn't that empires last forever. It's that they think they can break the pattern just because they see it. Spain believed gold would make them invincible. Britain believed its empire would never end. The Soviet Union believed ideology could defy reality. And now America believes technology, progress, and innovation can outsmart history itself. But the truth is, the pattern was never about money or armies. It was about human nature. Every time we rise, we forget humility. Every time we achieve comfort, we stop questioning. And when we stop questioning, decline begins. The real enemy has never been another nation. It's arrogance, the quiet voice that whispers, "We're different." That's the same voice that told kings to overspend, generals to overreach, and politicians to print more money instead of facing hard truths. It's the voice that replaces discipline with denial, responsibility with excuses, and reality with fantasy. That voice has ended every empire that ever believed it couldn't happen to them. But history isn't just a record of failure. It's also a mirror showing us what we could still change if we had the courage to look. Empires die, but people endure. Collapse doesn't have to mean destruction. It can mean awakening. Maybe the end of one system is just the start of remembering what truly matters. Not endless expansion, but balance. Not dominance, but wisdom. If we ever want to break the cycle, We'll have to do what no empire has done before: choose restraint over pride, learn from the past before we're forced to repeat it, build not on illusion, but on truth. The fall of power doesn't need to be the end of civilization. It can be the start of maturity if we're willing to see the pattern not as punishment, but as warning. Because in the end, history doesn't destroy us. It teaches us. It shows us what happens when we forget where real strength comes from. And every time the cycle begins again, it quietly asks the same question: will this generation finally listen? For now, the answer is unwritten. The cycle is still turning, the cracks still widening, the illusion still holding. But the moment we stop pretending we're different, we might finally become something stronger. Not another empire destined to fall, but a civilization wise enough to learn before it's too late. The pattern is there for all to see. The question is not whether it will repeat, but whether we will.